us. So, in response to the coronavirus sweeping across the US, the federal government has bailed out landlords while leaving renters like me in the lurch. Our next guest is a housing attorney at the Legal Aid Society who works with tenants facing eviction. Erin Neff is here to talk about how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted her clients and how we can best advocate for them to maintain their basic right to shelter. Erin is a lawyer again at the Legal Aid Society, where she represents low income families in Brooklyn who are facing eviction. Erin, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Can you talk about what your clients are going through right now during this pandemic?
Um, well, I think one thing that's been coming out a lot in the news recently is the disparate impact of COVID-19 on Black people and communities of color. Um, and if you ever walk into housing court, one day when it's open, I suggest anyone walking to housing court one day just to see the stark reality of the fact in Brooklyn, almost all the tenants are Black. You see there, it's sort of like pews. There's like a little where people wait to see the judge, and it's almost all Black people.
What
And
happens in housing court for those folks who aren't necessarily following this, or we have a lot of people from out of the country as well?
sure, I mean, I think a better title for it would be eviction court than
Right.
housing court.
Mhm.
It's basically where landlords hold poor people hostage for money, with the threat of kicking them out of their home if they don't pay rent that they owe, or they claim that they violated their lease in some way, and if they don't, you know remedy whatever violation of the lease, then they get kicked out. So that's basically what happens in housing court. So every day, in New York City, there's probably thousands of people go through housing court, um, and they either pay a lot of money or go to trial or litigate an issue, and then a decent number of those people are evicted.
Mm.
Though I would say a lot of people do stay in their homes, who still go through the eviction proceeding. But the larger point is making is that so a lot of my clients are people of color. Most of them are Black, and the impact that you're hearing on the news is the same for my clients. Several of my clients have uh, contracted COVID-19. A lot of them are in desperate situations of needing food, of needing help. Most of them don't have savings. Um, Almost all of them have lost their jobs, aside from a few who are considered essential. Um, and it's a really difficult situation. Meanwhile, you have, trying to apply for unemployment to get some help, and the website keeps crashing.
Right.
So
Has
it's
the state, where are we in terms of the state policy around evictions? I heard rumors that state government was going to stop evictions. Are we there yet?
So there is a moratorium on evictions. It started in March. It's a 90-day moratorium, so it'll go until about mid-June. It's possible that it can be extended. Um, and then generally what happens with the housing court process is before you can evict people, you have to go through housing court. So it sort of depends on. So right now, housing court is closed except for essential services. So when it reopens, that's when sort of the eviction process can like get started.
Mhm.
So depending on when that reopens, evictions might get started once the moratorium is lifted, or maybe a month or two after.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, wait, let me get this straight. They're still going through some of the court proceedings just to prepare them to be able to evict people when the moratorium is lifted?
No, 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 no. So right
Oh, that
now,
is way horrible. Okay.
yeah, no, that's not.
Got the
Sorry
wrong.
if I wasn't clear about that. What's happening is that housing court is open, for basically four types of cases. One, if someone has been locked out by their landlord, they can file a petition with housing court to try to be let back in. Two, if someone was evicted like prior to all this happening and they're trying to get back in, they can bring a proceeding before housing court. Three is emergency repairs. If your ceiling's falling in, if something crazy is happening, you can go to housing court and try to get an emergency repair done. And then there's sort of like a catch-all that landlords can use, like what's called an emergency order to show cause. So if they for some reason find it to be an emergency to kick someone out, they can bring that before the court and the court will make a determination on that.
How, are landlords taking advantage of tenants despite the moratorium on evictions? What has been the impact on folks unable to pay their rent?
Well, it's really hard to know from like the lawyer's standpoint because so much happens before a lawyer ever gets to see what's going on,
Mm.
right? I mean, even in normal times, landlords are able to coerce, pressure, threaten tenants to leave, and tenants might not necessarily know that they have the right to go to housing court, might not necessarily know they have the right to challenge a landlord. So people leave all the time without ever getting to see a lawyer.
Mm.
So it's hard for us to know that, but sort of anecdotally, there have been stories of tenants trying to organize with their neighbors to sort of address the situation, not being able to pay rent, and landlords saying like, and no matter what, like you have to keep paying rent. It's illegal for you to withhold your rent, which is not entirely true.
Mm.
Um, and there are there are cases where landlords are trying to use it's not super frequently, but trying to use the emergency OSC, or to show cause provision to like bring cases before the judge is saying like, no, it's an emergency to kick this person out because they have coronavirus or something like that. But it seems so far the judges aren't listening to that and being like, well, if they have coronavirus, that's a reason why they shouldn't be kicked out.
That's good. Okay, so that's a plus. Yeah. So that's a
Small
positive. That's
victories.
good. That's good. What do you think of a rent strike? Does that put tenants at risk?
I think that, well, New York City has a really, really strong history of rent strikes, and that has led to some of the best tenant protections that we have today. In the early 20th century, there were massive rent strikes across the city, and that helped lead to some of the first rent regulation laws in New York City. And at the end of the day, if you believe housing is a human right, and you believe that landlords are parasites, which I believe, you know,
Here's
just don't show this video to my landlord. Um,
secret.
but then tenants have the right to collectively organize, and the strongest power a tenant has is to withhold their rent in the same way the strongest power a worker has is to withhold their labor. And that's the means and capital with which landlords survive. Um, and some of the only ways tenants can force landlords to do emergency repairs, to fix massive lead paint violations in their apartment and stuff like that is to withhold their rent and to collectively organize. Um, I mean, with that being said, there are risks that come with going on a rent strike. Um,
Isn't it more difficult for people who say have, now I don't necessarily understand exactly how this works, but when you're on, say, public assistance for your rent, doesn't the check go directly to the landlord? So how would a person in that situation or, organize a rent strike?
that's a good question. So that is true that if you're getting rent paid through public assistance, it does go directly to the landlord. But usually tenants have a share that they pay,
Hmm.
so they could withhold their share.
Mhm. Okay, that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about? Uh, I'm not sure if you can, but there are people who are sort of not necessarily poor people, but there are people who are sort of middle class folks, working class folks, and the rent is so high in New York City everywhere that those folks are unable to pay sort of their regular rent. Have you seen any influx of these people who are asking for some sort of abatement in terms of rent?
I think you're right in that assessment. I think I have had friends reaching out to me, knowing I'm a housing alert, and asking me what to do. Who under normal circumstances might not find themselves in housing court. So I think there's definitely an increase in that. I mean, there's what 6 million people, over 6 million people have applied for unemployment, and I think you're going to see more of that, and people who aren't who in outside of New York City, people who can't pay their mortgages as well.
What could the state do? Could the state say, okay, so I understand if your landlord, um, has to pay a mortgage, right, to a bank, and they need the money to pay the mortgage to the bank. Maybe I'm thinking small potatoes here, but couldn't the state say we're going to ask our banks to withhold collecting mortgage payments for a month or however long this is going to go? Could the state say to landlords who are making a certain amount of profit that they have to stop doing that for a certain, what could the state do that would be good for the tenants?
So right now, a lot of tenant organizations and tenant organizers, tenant unions are calling for rent to be canceled. So that's not just suspended, meaning you don't have to pay it now, but you have to pay it later, which essentially is just delaying the inevitable eviction as the rent piles up. But to cancel it so that
That's what I
people,
meant. Cancel. Yeah, I meant
yeah,
that. It's just nothing for April.
yeah, yeah,
You're off
and
the hook.
that and the funny thing is that everyone is suffering right now, right? A lot of people have lost their jobs or have had an extreme cut in hours. A lot of people are losing their incomes. But as it stands right now, landlords don't have to suffer any of that because ultimately they'll still be able to um, sue for rent once housing court reopens. Like they might be in a little bit of a bind now, but right now there's nothing that is preventing landlords from fully realizing all the rent that
Mm,
they charge.
mhm.
Um, and I think like the federal the the federal bailout that just passed, giving people about $1,200 or so. I mean, at the end of the day, without something like a rent cancellation, that's just a further bailout for landlords. That money is just
Right.
going to go straight to rent. And if you live in New York City, that's like half a month rent.
Yeah, a quarter. It's a half of your rent.
Yeah, so you'll
For
you'll get that
12 months.
money, pay it
Yeah.
to your landlord, get evicted, and end up with nothing.
Ah. Oh my. Well, then my gratitude note to the President Trump for the $1,200 is I'm ripping it up, shall we say. How can renters who can pay their rent act in solidarity with renters who cannot?
So the strength of any sort of rent strike or tenant union comes with acting collectively. Um, the same way a labor strike would, right? If half a union went on strike or half a workforce went on strike, the other half would enable the functioning of the company to continue. So standing in solidarity is working with your neighbors to collectively decide how you're going to address these issues that makes your building, your neighborhood more powerful, and to understand that you're one piece of a whole. So if you can pay your rent, if you're lucky enough to have a lot of savings, to have a trust fund, whatever it is, but your neighbors aren't, um, and they want to go on rent strike or they want to take another course of action, you need to stand in solidarity with your neighbors. I think one thing that we're seeing through this pandemic is that it's something that is affecting everybody. Um, and some people more than others, but no one can 100% escape from it. So we need to be there for each other to help each other out.
We're speaking with Erin Neff, housing attorney. Erin, you said that landlords are parasites. Could you expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Um,
And remember, your audience here is very friendly to what you're saying. You're not convincing anybody, but it's just nice to kind of hear
sure, sure,
about the parasitism that is innate in this activity.
sure. Well, if you stop and think about rent, right? Like, why do you pay rent? Um, and some of us might initially think this is ridiculous. When I first came across the thought of not paying rent, I thought it was really silly because we are so used to it. Like I grew up as a renter, moving all the time because our landlord wouldn't renew our lease. But I still thought like, yeah, you have to pay rent. But when you stop and think about it, for most people, the cost of building their apartment, of putting in the fixtures, that's already been paid off. The cost of the labor of that has been paid off. Most people are sitting in an apartment where they don't get regular repairs. They're paying, $1,000+ a month. And where does that money go to? Um, at the end of the day, it goes into the pocket of some person or some limited liability corporation that happens to have their name on a deed, because we as a society has said it's okay to do that. It's okay to buy a property and charge people money for it. Whereas if we lived in a society that believes housing need,
I'm
all these
sorry. So
homes.
repeat that exact phrase because it chopped up, and I feel like that was probably perhaps the most important phrase of the day. If we lived in
Sure,
a
sure.
society that believed what?
If we lived in a society that believed housing is a human right and that housing is an essential need, it wouldn't be a profit-based system, right? Right now, housing is a profit-based system, and even if a landlord has to pay a mortgage or whatever it is, that's just another layer of the profit-motivated system, right? But if it was a system based on human need, then people would be paying little to no rent, and what you do pay would be going in to fix the things that you need in the apartment building or in your apartment. But right now that's not what happens. So landlords sit there half the time, do nothing, and just collect checks.
My God, you're making me mad. Yes.
And that's essentially what a parasite does, right?
Yeah.
They suck out your life essence, and in this case, it's your income, which you might need for food to send your kids to school, and they just suck that for no reason. And so I like to call landlords either parasite or a legalized form of a mafia,
Mm.
because they hold people hostage for money, in order to have the basic need of living in a home.
And most landlords would not think that of themselves because of the system that we're in. It's just no one has thought through public-private property rules, and just to have that thought that shelter is a basic human right, just like medical care should be a basic human right. I think we can't put that out there enough. I'd also like to say that so you've said that landlords are parasites. Trump started out as a landlord. So by the transitive property of parasitism, Trump is a parasite. Would you stand by that?
He is the Mac Daddy of all parasites, I would say.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for coming on the program, Erin. Final things that you'd like people to know who want to stand in solidarity with people who are, at risk of losing their housing, or where can people who are interested in fighting for a society where where housing is considered a basic human right go?
So what I would say is, one, it's not illegal to organize your building. You have the right to organize a tenant union in your building. It's harder with social distancing, but you can put up signs in your hallway. I would also suggest to go to the Right to Counsel Coalition website, where they have a rent strike toolkit and other information on organizing as tenants. If you Google Right to Counsel Coalition, it should pop up.
Right to
Um,
Counsel Coalition.
yes.
Excellent.
Um, and it's you gotta stay in solidarity with your neighbors. You gotta organize collectively. Um, and I don't know, does that answer your question? I think I
It
forgot the
does. No,
second,
it absolutely
but
does. And I really appreciate you coming on here. We're speaking with Erin Neff, housing attorney here in New York City. You can follow on Twitter if you want to follow these issues at Legal Aid NYC. Thanks, Erin. I really appreciate you coming on, and thanks for fighting the fight for fighting the good fight.
thanks. And just one more thing I wanted to say is that also, if you call 311, you can also get directed to a housing helpline. So if people have general questions and are concerned, also try calling 311.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Erin. I appreciate it.
Thank
And we'll
you.
see you again. I hope you come on again with a lot of success stories about what has happened during COVID to convince people that we're living in a crazy, insane, parasitic society, and it doesn't have to be that way.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thanks.